Teams often struggle with writing effective requirements. So today in my webinar, I want to take you through the process of following some good practices right from the very start with a simple requirement, refining it into something that the whole team can understand that hasn't got any complexities or ambiguities associated with it, right the way through into executing some tests against it as part of a sprint. The scenario I'm going to use is one I'm quite often use. It's a pizza delivery shop, online ordering system through a website or an app maybe, something you hopefully are all very familiar with. You customize a pizza, add it to a basket, and then you follow it right through to a checkout. So let's start with that. And I'm going to use Jira, of course, and start with a very simple requirement that's been in the backlog. This is the initial requirement. Very simple, just written down out of someone's head as an idea. But it's obviously not enough to give you a really concise idea of what's being asked for. And it's open to a lot of interpretation. Product owner's not necessarily going to get what he's asked for with something this simple. So one of the things the team need to do is gather together and talk it through. And then make this a better requirement that everyone can understand. And the trouble is with having imprecise requirements is not only that you might not get what you're after, which is waste, work will have to be redone, but also that it might take a lot longer than you expected. So a simple requirement like this, the team might estimate it's 3 points, 5 points, something like that. But once they work on it, it might turn out to be a lot more complicated than they thought. So it might even be 13, 20 point story, something like that. And those sorts of behaviours mean that the team are quite often missing their sprint goals because they've underestimated the story. Things are going to take a lot more longer. Other things that they've committed to or forecast in the sprint, they're not going to deliver because of this. So very important, if we spend some time right at the start preparing, creating a good foundation, will pay dividends for the reliability and the predictability of the teams. Now, in order to make this requirement a lot more easy to understand and concise, we're going to use what's called a user story format. A lot of you will be familiar with this. It's very commonly used in agile ways of working, but it doesn't just have to be used in agile. You can use it in whatever way of working you've got. It's just a really good format. And it has 3 parts to it. It starts with as a, and it represents the actor at this point. So I'm going to say just as a customer. The next part of the user story format is what they want. So I want in this case to be able to create a custom pizza from ingredients. And the final bit represents the value that the actor is going to receive from this requirement. And we use the format so that we represent the value. And in this case, the value is that they can get exactly the pizza they want. Type that in. Desire. Having a clear idea of the value obviously makes it very clear that this story is valuable. And if you can represent something that is valuable, that gives us the reason why we're going to deliver this. Having an understanding of the actor understands a bit more about who it is that's valuing it and the characteristics or the type of work or interfaces that they're going to need in order to get the most of this. Let's try and make this a little bit better. So I've described the actor as the customer, but it's a bit too generic. And a common practice that teams employ is to create personas that represents the different sorts of customers and their different particular needs that they might have. I've got a customer in mind who already valued from this feature. I'm going to call him Picky Pete. Now, Picky Pete, as his name suggests, doesn't like to take anything off the standard menu. He's got his own particular taste. And it might be that Picky Pete is a new market that we're doing. Maybe he doesn't shop at us because he can't get the pizza he wants. So we might be able to open our market to new people because he's a new type of persona that we're reaching. He might also be a particular customer that comes in that we know him. It might be a regular or something like that, based on a regular. He has a particular need that maybe he slows the process down by asking for something different each time. Or who knows what he asks for, but it's got particular challenges. He might have other characteristics. He might be computer literate, in which case he doesn't need a lot of prompting or help in the application. Could be an elderly person with perhaps very limited computer experience, in which case you might need some prompting and help if he's getting into a particular type of user experience. So having these clues and these background stories to these individuals really does help a lot, because it helps the whole team understand the sorts of needs that these people are going to have. And it really does make sure that this requirement is being built around their particular needs. The next thing is look at the language that we're using. So I use the word over here, ingredients. Is that a confusing term? Does that make sense to everybody? Now, this is just a pizza online shop. Should be familiar to people. It should be fairly straightforward. If this was financial services or avionics or something like that, we might have some very complex terms that we're using. Do they mean the same thing? Ingredients in this case could be the flour and yeast and things that make the pizza base. That might be the ingredients. So how about we use the word toppings instead? That's a clearer term. Those are the food items that go on top of a pizza. That's the generic term for it, I suspect. Having a glossary of terms that the team can reference and match against their user stories really makes all the difference. It makes sure we are talking about the same thing. There's no ambiguities or complexities. I'm much happier with this. It's looking a lot better. This concise user story format helps define the initial idea, but it's not enough to fully define what's needed. The reason why it's called a story is that it's just really meant as the initial start of a story. It's the once upon a time beginning. And then the idea is that those three amigos I mentioned earlier get together and then collaboratively they build out the rest of the story to its ending. Before you do that, though, we can capture some of that information in the description. Add as much detail as you want at this point that's useful to the team. You don't need to overdo it, though, but give them enough. And try and include some examples. Examples help define the requirement in a really easy to understand way. And if you've got a pizza shop that's been selling pizzas for a while, you've got some examples of the sorts of things your customers are probably asking for already that you can use as use cases, which help test and give people the idea of what's being expected. So I've added into the description a couple of examples of things that people have been asking. But here comes the real magic. It's the area called acceptance criteria. And I've added a custom field to Jira to capture that information. The acceptance criteria is meant to be testable ways of making sure that we're giving them exactly the right functionality that they want right from the start. And we understand things like the edge cases and what's really being expected. So I'm going to role play a little bit of a discussion between, say, the product owner and the other two members of the development team. So product owner might introduce the story, might give those examples, and then open up for any questions. So the tester might say, well, how many toppings can they have? Can they just, add as many as they want? Is that a problem? That's good points as the product owner. Well, maybe a maximum of 5. Okay, so we'll type that in. Maximum 5 toppings are allowed on a pizza. Any more gets refused. Okay. So is there a minimum? Ask the tester again. Well, if they don't add any, then it's just a margarita pizza. Might as well just get that off the menu. So there has to be at least 1. Okay, so there's a minimum of 1 topping. That's good. So now we've got some tests that we can use to bound check the number of toppings that are being added to a pizza. So what's Mickey Pete's favourite pizza? Ask the developer to the product owner. Always double chicken and red onion. This is the developer. Means you can have more than 1 of the same topping. I didn't realise that. That's interesting. So let's introduce a bit more complexity to this now, because we can choose multiple items of the same type and add to the pizza. We can add, 2 of the same. You will add 3. Well, no, says the product owner. That'd be silly. Just 2 is the maximum. Okay, that's fine. So up to 2. Same topic. That's good. Okay. Are there any exceptions to that? Ask the tester. So maybe the product owner says the fiery chili is too hot. If you had 2 portions of that, they might end up getting sued, for example. Okay, that's another business rule. It's getting more complicated all the time as they talk through examples and use cases. And this is really where the personas shine, because we've got an idea of who this Picky Pete is and his favourite pizzas and stuff. This is opening up a whole new world of acceptance criteria that we hadn't considered right at the start. That if we'd released this, we might have failed at the first hurdle, because Picky Pete would have come in and he'd only been able to add 1 portion of chicken or 1 topping to his pizza, and that wouldn't have done it. So he wouldn't have been satisfied with the output. So this is why it's so important to spend some time at this phase getting it right and spending time on it. Okay, we've finished writing the acceptance criteria. We've got quite a few now. The story's feeling a lot more robust and clear than it did when we started this whole process. So that's great, just where we want it to be. The next step is think about size. How big is this story now? Can the team estimate it? Actually, it feels quite a bit of work, especially this requirement at the top here, where we're going to have to provide some sort of user experience to help the customer choose the sort of category of toppings they're after. It's quite a bit of work designing that UX, implementing it, writing it, testing, those sorts of things. So maybe this is quite a large story. And teams, agile teams especially, that are trying to fit a piece of work into a sprint, need to make sure their stories are small enough that they flow quickly and easily and don't get blocked. So in this case, maybe this could be split into a couple of stories. That way, gives you the benefit of being able to perhaps deliver them in separate sprints if necessary, gives you a lot of flexibility. Or even if they are delivered in the same sprint, delivering this story ahead of the story that has the searching and filtering capability means that you can get some quick and early feedback from the core requirement that's being asked for. And there might be a couple of outcomes. Firstly, by delivering this story without this searching and filtering capability to start with, the product owner might give some feedback to the team that might help them understand the next story a lot better. Or it might be that just simply they don't need to do it because the first part of the story being delivered was enough for the needs of the product owner. So splitting stories down into smaller chunks should be a common practice. It should be asked every time a team are working together on breaking down a story and defining it, just to help make things flow quicker and more effectively. So we're going to remove this acceptance criteria requirement at the top there, and we'll build that into a separate story, perhaps linking them together in Jira so that we understand there's a relationship. And also that this one should be delivered before the other one, so they need to be ranked in order in the backlog. Okay, really pleased with that. The team are quite happy. Before we move on, we'll do a couple more checks. So we've got a few more personas, and it's a good practice to then run those other personas against the requirement and the acceptance criteria to make sure they fit. So maybe pregnant Penelope who likes anchovies and banana. Maybe that's her favourite pizza at the moment. Does that work? Yeah, I think it does. We can choose both of those ingredients. Maybe hungry Harry who likes very large loaded pizzas. He wants 5 items. He wants ham, beef, pepperoni, onions and chilies. Could he do that with this? Yes, he can. I think it passes. So our personas are other customers who might use this feature are satisfied if we know that there's no edge cases that might mean that we're not delivering what they need. Fantastic. Final check and then we're done. We're going to use an acronym called INVEST, which stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimatable, small and testable. And we go through each of those with the story just to make sure that it's suitable for bringing into a sprint. So is it independent? Can we work on this story and deliver it without being blocked by something else or being hampered? Sure, we can. I think we can do this independently. Fantastic. We could even deliver that other story I talked about earlier where we're searching and filtering. That could exist on its own before this one if you wanted to. Negotiable. All negotiable really means is that we're going to keep talking about this story until it gets coded, and even after that. But it's cheap and easy and quick to make changes at this stage. We keep it opening our minds to the fact that we might adapt this based on learnings. Is it valuable? Yeah, we understand the value that this is being given to. We understand the sorts of customers who are going to make use of it. We're sure that if we do develop this feature, customers are going to use it. If customers aren't, we need to challenge that and say, well, why are we doing it? Are there more important or valuable things that we should be doing? Can we estimate it? Yes. It's a really good test that if the team are not able to estimate something, they probably don't understand it, or there's too many, too big, or it's too complicated, or there's just they don't know what's being asked of them. If they can confidently estimate a story, you're in a good place. Is it small enough to fit within a sprint? Yes, we've sized this so that we can fit it within a sprint. It's say an 8-point story, for example. We know we can take that into a sprint and deliver it. And is it testable? Yes, we've got an acceptance criteria. It's got the edge cases and definitions of the boundaries that we're trying to deliver to. It's got some examples of tests or of orders that people do, which we can use as tests. I think this is in a really good case. We know what we'll need to do to test it once we've written the code. We're ready to go. Okay, so in summary, building this story out so far, we've recommended keeping the user story format in order to keep the definition of the story concise. Recommended using the three amigos, at least, or the whole team if you possibly can, to define the story. So you're working on a story collaboratively and building it out together. We've used personas that we've created beforehand in order to help understand who the customer is and their needs. We've created a glossary of terms, so we're all talking the same language and we understand what each other mean. And we're using acceptance criteria to build out the story from its basic user story format to something that we can now understand. Okay, we've now brought the story into a sprint, started the sprint, and the developer and the tester have picked up the story and moved it through progress. I'm going to work on this in parallel now. The developer can go start writing the code, and the tester will start writing the test cases. And hopefully, at some point in the near future, they'll both come together and make sure it all works together. For this, I'm going to use the excellent X-Ray for Jira tool, which allows us to create test cases within Jira, as its name suggests. And it not only lets us create, organize, and manage these test cases, but it provides that traceability that we need. So we can make sure that not only are these stories covered by tests, but also that tests have been executed against them. We get an audit history of the test executions and the fact that they may have succeeded or failed or whatever. So we've got that traceability in that audit, so we can prove, if we need to, the fact that we've done all this work and achieved all these testings and proven that functionality is correct. Let's create our first test. I'm going to move down to the test coverage part of the tool, and you can see that currently the state of this story is that it's uncovered. We haven't written any tests. So I'm going to create my very first test for this story. And my first test, I always like to create what I call the happy path, which is a successful test execution, just to prove the functionality works. So it gives us a summary of the test. We're just going to call this test happy path, for example, and I'm going to say we're going to do Picky Pete's favorite. Let's create that. Okay, go into this here. It's not been run yet, and we haven't defined it properly yet. I'm going to choose the test type now. This one we're going to have a manual test. Reality is we'd probably start with some manual tests maybe, but also we could be creating automated tests right from the start as well, if we've got testers who are skilled in writing automating tests, or we might get some of the other members of the development team to do that as well. We'll start with manual because it's very easy for us to do. Let's create our first test step. We'll have multiple steps that make up the test execution. So the first action is we're going to create and add a topping to the pizza. And we're going to add chicken. That's great. That's our first step. The expected result of this first step is that chicken will be added to the custom pizza. Fantastic. To repeat that for the second step, this is going to have multiple steps that you follow. When you're writing these test steps, it's important to remember that it might be someone who's not really played with this functionality before that is going to be executing this. So they need to be very concise, very easy to follow. Anybody should be able to pick these up and follow it. Step 2 is going to be created. Same sort of thing. Add another topping. Again, we're going to have chicken. This actually does two things. Not only is it testing our happy path of making sure that we can add multiple toppings, but we're also checking that we're adding two of the same kind to the pizza as well. Fantastic. I'm going to make it very clear. 2 chicken toppings on the pizza. That's great. Third step, I'm going to add some red onion, similar to what we had before. Add topping to pizza. It'll be red onion. And I'm going to make it very clear. Now there are 2 times chicken plus 1 times red onion on the custom pizza. Very clear, very easy to see whether it's working or not. Final step will be to check out, because I want to make sure we can complete the checkout of the pizza, get it into the basket, and then there'll be a transaction that follows. Check out pizza. No data for this one. Our expected result is custom pizza. Let's move that down a little bit. Basket. And this will have 2 times chicken. That's 1 times red onion. If we successfully execute the tests on all of these test steps, then this test case has been passed. As a tester, I've created a bunch of tests. Some of these are designed to pass. So, for example, I've got pizza with 5 toppings, I've got pizza with 3, 1 topping, etc. Just to try and make sure that it all works correct with functionality. And then I've tested the boundaries where we've tried adding more than 5 toppings. For example, I expect that to fail. Going to a checkout without adding a topping. Want to make sure that we're charging extra for the meats. All of the things we talked about in the acceptance criteria, we need tests against those. So there's a check and balance to make sure all of the acceptance tests that we defined earlier have been covered by these tests. But in addition, we need to make sure it succeeds and works as expected as well. Happy with this. You can see from the story, it is now covered by all of these items. So it's moved from the uncovered status shown here into not run, because we haven't actually executed any of these tests yet. Now, for convenience, and in order to organize these better, because it's a piece of functionality that I'm going to test together, I've created something called a test set. I'll just show you an example of this in the next tab. Test sets are used, just as the name suggests, to group things together very simply. So I've got a test set that has all of those tests I've created as part of it. And it might be that a test set contains tests from multiple stories brought in that are all doing the same thing. So I mentioned earlier the story perhaps that was going to filter or search for toppings. The test for that might come into the same part of functionality. So there might be 3 or 4 stories being brought together into one test set. We can manage those very easily. Now I've got this test set, which is X-ray 12. I can add that to my test plan. Now, because I'm working in an agile way, I might have a test plan that tests the output of the increment of the sprint that we're just working on. It might also be a regression test as well. So I could add this test set to multiple test plans if I want to, or I could add individual test cases to the test plan as well. It's up to me how I do it. Because I've organized things in the test, it's going to be very quick and easy to show you. I'm just going to add some tests to my test plan. I'm going to bring in tests from the test set because that's where I've organized it. There we go. I'm going to add that to the list. And it might be that if my sprint had multiple stories that were being developed and worked on, which is going to be likely to be the case, that this test plan would have quite a number of tests in it that need to be all passed or have some understanding of how well they've worked by the end. As you can see, at the moment, none of these have been executed yet. Last step, of course, is now to execute these tests. So I'll create a test execution from the test plan. I'm going to include all of the tests that we've defined as part of that. And then we'll start the execution. Takes us to a new page where we're tracking it. And we'll start with the first test, the test that was Picky Pete's favorite pizza. Let's make sure that works. Press the start button here. And takes us into the screen for controlling the test execution. And you can see each of the test steps clearly laid out, and we can go through and test the product, marking each of these steps as complete as we go. So we can tick off each of those, passing them as we go. If we do have a failure for some reason, we can log that, create a defect, or manage it with the developer, however you choose to manage your defect handling, and then resolve the problem. In this case, we'll say that we managed to successfully add all of the bits that we needed, so it's marked the test as complete. Testing now continues. I'm just going to quickly pass through these tests just to show you the outcome of the finish of testing. You don't have to go through each of the test steps with each of them test cases if you don't want to. Once you're a tester that's very familiar with the product, you can quickly skip through them because you know what you're doing. You don't need to refer to each of the test cases each time. So I'm just going to quickly pass all of these test cases. There we go. All of the test cases have now passed, and we've passed 8 of them. I'm going to move that to X-ray 1, which is a ticket with the original user story that we created right at the start of this webinar. Scroll down to the bottom. And you can see that now we're passed. So now we've proven that we have created the story, executed tests against it, and we're done. That's it for this webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it valuable. Thanks a lot for your time.